The Shawshank Redemption isn't just a prison drama, it's the prison drama. The film that somehow went from box office disappointment to perennial favorite. The movie that makes grown adults weep into their popcorn every time TNT runs it for the 800th time. It's a story about hope, friendship, and the world's most elaborate escape plan involving geology and a Rita Hayworth poster. But here's the thing. Even superfans who can quote Red's parole hearings verbatim might not know the full story behind how the Stephen King adaptation crawled through the Hollywood sewer pipe and came out clean on the other side. So today, we're counting down some genuinely surprising facts about the making of this 1994 masterpiece. From the casting shakeup that almost gave us entirely different leads, to the prop that sold for absurd money, to the weird way censors freaked out over a poster, these are the stories that didn't make it into Morgan Freeman's soothing narration. Ready to find out what really went down in those prison walls? Let's get into it. Number 20. The MPAA wanted to slap it with an NC-17 for language alone. Here's a fun fact that'll make you appreciate the creative accounting of movie ratings. The Shawshank Redemption was nearly branded with the box office kiss of death, an NC-17 rating, because of one four-letter word. The film drops the F-bomb a reported 25 times. Some counts say more, and in 1994, the MPAA had very specific rules about how many times you could say it before your movie became adults only. Darabont had to personally appeal to the ratings board, arguing that the language was authentic to the prison environment and never used gratuitously or in a sexual context. He reportedly showed them documentaries about actual prisons to prove his point. The board eventually relented and gave Shawshank an R rating, but it was close. Some international markets weren't as forgiving. Reports suggest certain TV airings in the UK and Australia had to bleep or mute so much dialogue that entire scenes became nearly incomprehensible. Number 19. Morgan Freeman. Allegedly fell asleep between takes and nobody cared. This one's delightful and possibly apocryphal, but multiple crew members have mentioned it over the years. Morgan Freeman, the consummate professional, apparently had a habit of dozing off in his chair between setups. We're talking full-on napping while lighting crews adjusted rigs and cameras got repositioned. In Freeman's defense, the Ohio State Reformatory was either sweltering or freezing. The shoot days ran long, and he was in nearly every scene. According to some reports, Darabont found it endearing rather than unprofessional. Freeman would be snoring softly 1 minute, then the AD would call rolling, and he'd snap awake and deliver a perfect take on the first try. His ability to flip the switch that quickly became something of a legend on set. Tim Robbins allegedly joked that Freeman had the superpower of instant consciousness. Number 18. The studio questioned casting. A black actor. As read. Let's get uncomfortable for a second. When Darabont pushed to cast Morgan Freeman, changing the character from a red-haired Irishman to a black man, Castle Rock executives reportedly expressed concerns. Not about Freeman's talent, everyone agreed he was brilliant, but about the optics of a film where a black convict becomes subservient friends with a white inmate who's smarter and eventually escapes to paradise. According to some accounts, studio notes questioned whether audiences would accept the racial dynamic, whether it would alienate Southern viewers, and whether the friendship would read as problematic to critics looking for racial subtext. Darabont apparently pushed back hard, arguing that the story was about friendship, transcending all boundaries, race included, and that Freeman brought a dignity and intelligence to Red that would eliminate any whiff of stereotype. Number 17. The opera scene got the film banned. In Egypt. Remember the soaring, transcendent scene where Andy locks himself in the warden's office and plays Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro over the prison PA system? Beautiful, right? Well, Egypt didn't think so. The film was reportedly banned in Egyptian theaters for several years because of that scene. Not because of the opera itself, but because of what it represented. Egyptian censors apparently took issue with the idea of a prisoner defying authority and creating a moment of beauty and rebellion without consequences. Well, immediate consequences. Andy gets thrown in the hole afterward, but during the scene, he's winning. In a country with a complicated relationship with political prisoners and dissent, the symbolism was too much. Some reports suggest the censors also objected to the film's critique of corrupt prison officials, seeing parallels to their own system. The ban was eventually lifted and Shawshank found an audience in Egypt through bootleg copies and satellite TV, but the initial censorship highlights something important. The film's themes of institutional corruption and individual resistance aren't just feel-good movie magic. Number 16. Clancy Brown terrified everyone on purpose. Clancy Brown, who played the sadistic Captain Hadley, committed so hard to the role that he allegedly made cast and crew genuinely uncomfortable. Reports from the set describe Brown staying in character between takes, maintaining Hadley's menacing energy even during lunch breaks. Some extras playing inmates reportedly asked Darabont if Brown could dial it back because they were having trouble separating the actor from the character. Brown himself has said in interviews that he wanted Hadley to feel like a real threat, not a cartoon villain. He studied prison guards, watched documentaries about correctional facilities, and cultivated a cold, unpredictable demeanor. The result is one of the most genuinely frightening authority figures in 90s cinema, a man who'll beat you half to death and then calmly go about his day. Here's the darker side. Brown's intensity apparently led to some heated moments on set. One story, possibly exaggerated, claims he got into a shouting match with a crew member who joked about his performance being over the top. Brown allegedly snapped back that if anyone thought guards like Hadley didn't exist, they were living in a fantasy. The crew member reportedly apologized. Number 15. The Rooftop beer scene. Cost a fortune and almost got cut. The iconic scene where Andy negotiates beers for his fellow inmates while they're tarring the rooftop, that was one of the most expensive and logistically complex sequences in the film, and Castle Rock executives nearly cut it for budget reasons. The scene required extensive safety rigging, stunt coordination, and multiple takes to get the blocking right. Reports suggest the scene went over budget by tens of thousands of dollars because of weather delays and safety protocols. The studio sent increasingly testy notes asking Darabont if the scene was essential, or if it could be trimmed. Darabont fought back, arguing that the rooftop moment was the first time we saw Andy assert himself and win. It's a scene that establishes him as a man who can manipulate the system. He was right, obviously. The image of those men drinking beers in the sun while Andy stands apart, looking satisfied, is one of the film's most indelible moments. It's also the scene that cements Red and Andy's friendship. Red's narration about feeling like free men, even for a moment, is the emotional heart of the first act. Number 14. The sisters' storyline was toned down, and it still caused controversy. Let's talk about Boggs Diamond and the sisters, the gang of inmates who assault Andy. In Stephen King's novella, the attacks are described in brutal, explicit detail. We're talking graphic depictions of the midnight tango of the most violent kind. Darabont knew he couldn't put that on screen without triggering an NC-17 rating or traumatizing audiences, so he implied the assaults rather than showing them. Even so, test audiences reportedly reacted with visible discomfort during those sequences. Some viewers complained that the film was too dark, too brutal, and that the attacks, even implied, made them want to leave the theater. Darabont received studio pressure to cut the storyline entirely or reduce it to a single vague reference. He refused, arguing that Andy's suffering was essential to the story. Without the sisters, Andy's friendship with Red and his eventual escape don't carry the same weight, but here's where it gets messy. Certain critics accused the film of exploiting assault for emotional manipulation. A few reviews questioned whether the attacks were narratively necessary or just trauma porn designed to make the audience root harder for Andy. It's a fair criticism, even if you disagree with it. The film walks a fine line between showing the reality of prison violence and using that violence as a plot device. Number 13. Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman. Barely spoke off camera. Here's a weird one. Despite their incredible on-screen chemistry, Tim Robbins and Morgan Freeman reportedly weren't close during filming and rarely socialized between takes. Multiple crew members have mentioned that the two actors were cordial but distant, each keeping to themselves in their trailers or dressing rooms. They'd rehearse, nail the scene, and then retreat to separate corners of the set. Some reports suggest this was partly due to their different approaches to acting. Freeman is famously laid back and intuitive, while Robbins is more method-oriented and internal. They simply worked differently, and that didn't lend itself to hanging out and swapping stories. There's also the possibility that they were just private people who didn't feel the need to be best friends in real life. Here's the twist. Darabont apparently encouraged the distance. According to some accounts, he felt that Red and Andy's friendship should feel hard-won and gradual, and if Robbins and Freeman were buddy-buddy off camera, it might undercut that slow-burn dynamic. Whether that's true or just a convenient narrative, the distance seems to have worked. Their scenes together crackle with the sense of two men carefully navigating each other's boundaries. Number 12. Stephen King sold the rights for beer money. Here's how you know. Stephen King is either incredibly generous or just doesn't care about money. He sold Frank Darabont the film rights to Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption for a grand total of $5,000. That's it. $5,000 for a novella that would become one of the most beloved movies ever made. Now, to be fair, Darabont was an unknown screenwriter at the time, and King had a history of giving young filmmakers cheap access to his Dollar Baby program for short films. But even by those standards, this was a sweetheart deal. According to reports, King never even cashed the check. He just framed it and sent it back to Darabont with a note saying, "In case you ever need bail money." The gesture was vintage King, supportive, slightly mischievous, and utterly unconcerned with maximizing profit. Number 11. Rob Reiner offered Darabont millions to walk away. So Darabont had the rights. Great, except Rob Reiner wanted them too. Badly. Reiner had already proven he could adapt King. His Misery won Kathy Bates an Oscar, and he came to Darabont with an offer that would have made most struggling writers faint. $2.5 million for the script, with Reiner directing and Tom Cruise as Andy Dufresne. Let that sink in. Tom Cruise, in the role Tim Robbins eventually played. Reiner would have turned Shawshank into a slick, star-driven studio picture with massive marketing muscle. Darabont said no. He'd never directed a feature before, but he'd promised himself that if he ever got the chance to direct Shawshank, he'd take it. Turning down $2.5 million when you're barely scraping by is the kind of insane conviction that either makes you a legend or leaves you waiting tables at 40. The gamble paid off, obviously, but imagine the alternate timeline where Cruise does his intense stare thing instead of Robbins' quiet dignity. Would we still be talking about it 30 years later? Number 10. The studio wanted a happier ending. Seriously, Castle Rock Entertainment backed the film, but that doesn't mean they were thrilled with Darabont's vision. Test audiences in the early 90s were notoriously skittish about ambiguity, and the original cut of Shawshank ended with Red on the bus, heading toward the Pacific and Andy, with Morgan Freeman's narration trailing off on a note of hope. No reunion on the beach, no wide shot of two friends meeting again in Zihuatanejo. Just Red, smiling, choosing hope. Studio executives reportedly pushed hard for the beach scene, the one we all know and love now, where Red walks across that gorgeous expanse of sand and embraces Andy while Thomas Newman's score swells. Darabont resisted at first, worried it was too sentimental, too on the nose. But after test screenings showed audiences craved that closure, he relented and shot the epilogue in the U.S. Virgin Islands. The scene cost an extra $100,000 or so, and it was filmed months after principal photography wrapped. Was the studio right? Well, that beach scene is now one of the most iconic endings in cinema history, so yeah, probably. Sometimes the suits know what they're talking about. Sometimes. Number 9. Morgan Freeman wasn't the first choice for Red. This one might sting a little, but Morgan Freeman wasn't originally who Darabont pictured. In Stephen King's novella, Red is a middle-aged Irishman with, and I quote, red hair. The character even jokes about his nickname. Darabont's early drafts reportedly considered actors like Clint Eastwood, Paul Newman, and Gene Hackman for the role. But once Freeman's name entered the conversation, everything clicked. Freeman had just come off Unforgiven and was riding a wave of critical acclaim. Darabont met with him, and within minutes, the director realized he'd been writing for Freeman all along without knowing it. They kept one sly nod to the source material. When Andy asked Red why they call him that, Freeman deadpans, "Maybe it's because I'm Irish. It's a blink and you'll miss it joke," but King fans appreciated the wink. Here's the kicker. Freeman was so convinced the role was perfect that he later said Shawshank was one of the few films he'd do again in a heartbeat. And thank goodness Darabont saw the light. Can you imagine Gene Hackman narrating those parole hearings? I mean, he's great, but no. Number 8. The maggot scene was real and disgusting. You know that scene where Brooks feeds his pet crow, Jake, a maggot? Yeah, that was a live maggot. The American Humane Association had reps set to make sure no animals were harmed, but apparently nobody. Extended that courtesy to the maggot. The crew had to wrangle actual live maggots for the shot, which sounds like the worst job assignment in film history. But it gets weirder. The crow itself became a minor diva. According to some crew members, one of the crows refused to cooperate and had to be retired mid-shoot. Another bird took over, and if you look closely, you can supposedly spot the inconsistency in feather patterns. Why does a maggot matter? Because Darabont's obsession with authenticity extended to the smallest, grossest details. He didn't want anything in Shawshank to feel fake or sanitized. Every element was designed to ground the story in gritty, tactile reality. That commitment to texture is part of why the movie still feels so real. Number 7. The prison was freezing, sweltering, and haunted. The Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, Ohio, wasn't just a filming location. It was a character. Built in the 1880s and closed in 1990, the prison had a reputation for being genuinely creepy. The cast and crew reported strange noises, cold spots, and at least one person swore they saw a shadowy figure in the east cell block. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, filming in a defunct prison with a violent history definitely added an edge to the performances, but the real nightmare was the temperature. The reformatory had no climate control, so during the summer shoot, actors sweltered in 100-degree heat while wearing wool prison uniforms. In the winter, some scenes were filmed months apart. The building was an icebox. Freeman later joked that he could see his breath during some of the interior shots, and Darabont had to plan carefully to avoid continuity errors with the actors' visible exhalations. Oh, and the place was structurally unsound. Chunks of ceiling plaster occasionally fell during takes. OSHA would have had a field day, but the location's authenticity was irreplaceable. You can't fake that in a studio. Number 6. Tim Robbins did his own stunt in the rain. Sort of. The iconic scene where Andy stands in the rain after escaping, arms spread wide like a reborn man. That's Robbins, and he's genuinely standing in a downpour. But here's the thing. The rain was artificial, pumped through a massive rig above the prison yard. And it wasn't just water. It was cold, pressurized water, blasted at high velocity to look dramatic on camera. Robbins stood under that deluge for several takes, shirtless, while the crew adjusted lighting and angles. By some accounts, he was out there for close to an hour. The scene was shot in the middle of the night to capture the right mood, which meant the temperature was already chilly and then they added freezing water. Robbins reportedly didn't complain once, fully committed to selling Andy's cathartic moments of freedom. Here's where it gets slightly less heroic. Darabont did use a body double for the wide shots where you can't clearly see Andy's face. So some of the rain-drenched glory belongs to an anonymous stunt performer who probably deserved a bonus. Still, Robbins took the brunt of it, and the scene remains one of the most indelible images in the film. Wet, cold, and utterly transcendent. Number 5. The movie bombed at the box office. Yup. The Shawshank Redemption, now frequently ranked as the greatest film of all time on IMDb, was a financial disaster when it hit theaters in September 1994. It opened against Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump, two cultural juggernauts, and got absolutely steamrolled. Audiences stayed away in droves. The film grossed only about $16 million domestically during its initial run, barely covering its $25 million budget. Critics liked it well enough, though not universally, and it snagged 7 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture. But it didn't win a single statue, losing most of its categories to, you guessed it, Forrest Gump. At the time, Shawshank was widely seen as a noble failure, a well-made film that simply didn't connect with mainstream audiences. Castle Rock was reportedly disappointed, and Darabont's career momentum stalled briefly. So what changed? Cable TV and VHS rentals. Throughout 1995 and 1996, Shawshank became a word-of-mouth sensation on home video. TNT aired it constantly, and suddenly everyone was talking about that prison movie. By the early 2000s, it had earned over $100 million in rentals and sales. The film didn't fail, it just needed time to find its audience. Redemption, indeed. Number 4. The famous poster was almost censored. Andy's escape hinges on a poster of Raquel Welch in 1 million years BC, the iconic image of Welch in a fur bikini. But that poster almost didn't make it into the film because of nervous studio executives who worried about the saucy two-step implications. In the novella, King cycles through posters of Rita Hayworth, Marilyn Monroe, and Welch as the decades pass. The movie does the same, showing Hayworth and Monroe before landing on Welch. Here's the rub. Censors and ratings boards in certain international markets flagged the Welch poster as too provocative. Some early test screenings reportedly had audiences giggling or making comments during the reveal, which undercut the dramatic tension. Darabont had to fight to keep the poster in the final cut, arguing that it was essential to the period detail and the plot. Without it, Andy's escape doesn't work. He needs a large, dramatic poster to cover the tunnel entrance. In the end, the poster stayed, and it's now one of the most recognizable props in film history. The actual poster used in the film sold at auction years later for tens of thousands of dollars. All that hand-wringing over a woman in a fur bikini, and it turned into a cultural artifact. Sometimes you just have to trust the vision. Number 3. Brooks's suicide scene almost didn't happen. The heartbreaking sequence where Brooks Hatlin, the elderly librarian, carves Brooks was here into a beam before hanging himself is one of the film's most devastating moments, but Darabont originally scripted it differently. Early drafts had Brooks simply disappearing after his release, with Red narrating that he heard Brooks died in a nursing home. Off-screen, implied, tidy. Test audiences hated it. They felt cheated, like the story had abandoned a character they'd grown to care about. Darabont went back and rewrote the scene, giving Brooks a full arc. The halfway house, the job bagging groceries, the pigeon he sets free, and finally the suicide. James Whitmore, who played Brooks, reportedly wept after reading the new pages. He knew it was going to wreck audiences, and it did. The Brooks was here scene is now taught in film classes as an example of economical, devastating storytelling. It's maybe 2 minutes of screen time, but it carries the emotional weight of an entire subplot. Whitmore earned an Oscar nomination for the role, pretty remarkable for what amounts to a supporting part. The scene works because it doesn't flinch. It shows the cruel reality of institutionalization. That almost didn't happen. Number 2. The final beach scene was shot at the last minute. We talked earlier about the studio wanting a happier ending, but here's the wild part. Darabont didn't shoot the Zihuatanejo beach reunion until after the movie had already wrapped and test screenings were underway. The original cut ended on the bus with Red, and when audiences expressed frustration at not seeing the reunion, Darabont scrambled to organize a beach shoot. The location was the U.S. Virgin Islands, standing in for the Mexican coast. Robbins and Freeman flew out separately, squeezed the shoot into a couple of days, and then flew home. The scene has exactly 0 dialogue. Just Red walking across the sand, Andy sanding his boat, and the 2 men shaking hands and laughing. Thomas Newman's score does all the heavy lifting. Some purist scenarios still argue the original ending was stronger, more ambiguous, truer to the film's themes, but box office and fan polls suggest the beach scene was the right call. It gave the audience the emotional catharsis they craved after 2+ hours of suffering and hope. And let's be honest, that final image of Red and Andy by the blue water is chef's kiss perfect. Sometimes the last minute addition becomes a definitive moment. Number 1. The oak tree became a pilgrimage site, then got destroyed. In the movie, Andy tells Red to look for a specific oak tree in Buxton, Maine, where he's hidden a box with money and a note. The tree was real, or at least, the production used a real tree in Malabar Farm State Park in Ohio for the scene. After Shawshank became a cultural phenomenon, fans started making pilgrimages to the site, carving their initials, leaving notes, and taking photos. It became a legitimate tourist attraction. But here's the tragic twist. In 2016, the tree collapsed during a storm. It had been weakened by age, rot, and possibly by the thousands of visitors who'd climbed on it over the years. Local officials mourned its loss, and chunks of the tree were auctioned off for charity, raising over $70,000. Some pieces were turned into commemorative items sold to benefit the Shawshank Museum in Mansfield. Why does a tree matter? Because Shawshank has always been about symbols: hope, freedom, resilience. That oak tree stood for all of it, and fans responded by literally traveling hundreds of miles to touch a piece of movie magic. The tree's collapse feels almost poetic, doesn't it? Nothing lasts forever, but the story endures. You can still visit the site. There's a plaque and a few saplings growing nearby. Hope, as Red might say, is a good thing. And there you have it, a dozen facts that prove the Shawshank Redemption is even weirder and more wonderful than you thought. From Stephen King's $5,000 handshake to a tourist magnet tree that literally fell apart, this movie's legacy is built on wild coincidences, last-minute decisions, and one director's stubborn refusal to compromise his vision. Next time you're watching Red and Andy's reunion on TNT at 2 in the morning, remember, That beach scene almost didn't exist, and the whole movie almost starred Tom Cruise. Sleep tight with that image. Now, if you excuse me, I need to go carve Brooks Was Here into my desk and ugly cry for the 15th time this year.